guessing that's where this has to go. Okay, so here we are. This is our third session on Bernardo Kastrup's The Idea of the World. For this evening, we were going to read section 2, which is laying out his ontology, his idealistic ontology, and that's kind of the topic of discussion. So we do have, for those of us who have been here all along, Jeffrey Edwards has showed up this evening. He's been a long time regular at many cafes and has hosted quite a few himself. When he contacted us and said he was going to come in this evening, I thought that would be very nice. Do you want to say just a couple of words to introduce yourself there, Jeffrey?
Sure. So I'm not quite, I try and keep it to a couple of words. So I'm an academic, just retired, worked in a lot of work in embodiment issues. So, and some work on quantum physics some discussions I've done with Marco on quantum physics. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, but obviously and probably ideologically or philosophically, I'm probably in the bottom-up panpsychic, what Kastrup calls bottom-up panpsychic, rather than the idealist camp. But I do find it interesting to look at the idealist ontology. I think it's a very interesting take on the context. So, is that good? Is that what you had in mind? And I'm based in Quebec City in Canada. So.
We have a very international crowd here. This is, which makes it really exciting kind of thing. Okay, no, that's exactly what I was hoping for, Jeffrey. That's really nice. So I'm going to assume that everybody was diligent and read every single word of every single chapter. You know? It's not exactly a page turner. Okay, I get through a couple of pages, I have to set it down and I go walking around for a little bit and come back to it. Because, and this, I found these two chapters were not only longer than the other chapters have been in the book. But as we had mentioned in our little chat before everyone showed up, they're probably the densest chapters. He's packing the most into the limited amount of space that he has available, and that makes it for very challenging reading, I think. So I don't know how you all want to approach this, but of the two chapters, in one he kind of lays out what it is that he thinks his ontology consists of. He's trying to solve that mind-body problem, and then in the second chapter, he goes into more detail on trying to make sense of what he considers to be this mental universe. So,
but he solves this mind-body problem by denying the body. It's not exactly solving it.
Well, that's one of those points, not to jump in too deep too quickly. He makes a statement in there that and it's one of those statements that people make that is very troublesome for me. He more or less says that we're brains. Well, that brain is part of a body. I mean, brains don't. I saw The Man with Two Brains, the movie with Steve Martin, and there can be disembodied brains, and you can transfer contents and things. It's a very entertaining and comical movie. But in the reality that I happen to exist in, they don't do that yet. So all of those brains end up in bodies. So later, then, especially in chapter 6, that body, what defines our physical body, becomes an extremely important criteria for him in trying to determine where does mentation and how does it affect, and where's the impingements and things that are going on. We can get to that a little later, I'm sure. But that's one of those places where, for as much as he loves consistency, he's not always consistent. If I'm the brain, and later, about 5 pages later, he says it's the nervous system. And so the brain is part of our nervous system, I guess, physiologically. I'm not up to speed on all of these things. But I don't like to think that I'm just a brain. But although people have accused me of being not a very good one. If I am a brain, you know, probably needs a little help, but that's beside the point. So what we did the last time was kind of get some first impressions, because it's just like, you know, Jeffrey had a good point there. Are there other points that others have come up with that where you thought it went well, or maybe where you stumbled when you were, you know, reading through this? I was hoping in one sense that Marco was going to finish his chapter on parsimony, but because that word shows up a lot in these two chapters.
Yeah,
shows up a lot.
I wrote an essay on that, and I have a blog. I opened a blog. I can send you the link in the chat, so you can take a look. And there you can understand why what my point is, because it's a bit long. But I have some reservations what concerns this idea of Occam's razor, and I think it's not a scientific criterion in my point of view. But it is taken as something that if you don't apply Occam's razor everywhere and cut down everything, then it seems that you are not scientific, and I don't agree to this attitude. I look for the link and will send you.
That'll be good. We always like to have links to other things. We certainly don't have enough to read. Michael was complaining about that at one point, that he just, you know, he's lacking pages. He said, you gotta feed me pages. So, okay, well then let me ask all of you this. What do you think is the strongest point that he's making, or what's the strongest aspect of his case for this idealistic ontology? Whether or not you yourself, you know, Jeffrey outed himself. He's not necessarily an idealist. Neither am I, but I still, for many of the same reasons, find this very interesting to pursue, because I think there's things to be learned from engaging seriously other ways of seeing things. Okay. So, anybody want to volunteer?
Well, yes. First of all, I would like to know also what you mean by brain, or because from what I understand, so the thing is, and this might be a language thing, I also found it quite dense, and I was trying to integrate or interiorize, understand. But so the most, one of the strongest thing that he says is like consciousness is the ontological primitive, right? So in that sense, he doesn't even like, there is not even the problem of the hard problem of consciousness. It even doesn't get to that, because everything is consciousness. So in comparison to physicalism, I think it's like, for me, it resonates that it's between these two, the explanatory power of his proposal is stronger than physicalism what comes to consciousness.
I agree that physicalism is so limited that it's kind of a low bar to cross to improve on that model. But we expect more of Bernardo, right? It's not really good enough to just manage to, you know, to trash physicalism in an enjoyable way, which he does. Although it could be more entertaining, right? But like his diagrams are a little geeky. Anyway, that was just the thought.
I think there is a quite strong statement that he makes that, let's say, conscious experience, our, let's say, experiences cannot be explained even in principle by physicalism. This is really very, I mean, I think is the strongest thing that he says, because only by saying that statement, I think you can disregard physicalism as having any chance today or in the future to really being able to explain consciousness and our conscious experience, which is basically what we experience ourselves. And the only way for other people to know what we experience is by ourselves reporting that, but the others cannot experience what we experience, right? And he says and states that even in principle, physically couldn't explain those conscious experiences. And yeah, for me, that's the strongest thing. Of course, then he builds, and it's a quite a, let's say, constructivist approach, if you want, this whole, let's say, ontology, idealist ontology, with all those, starting from a series of facts that nobody would dispute, and then starting building one inference at a time, right? Until basically positing his ontology. I think it's a very kind of a solid, you know, edification of that ontology, I must say. I have some reservations in some areas. Some of the inferences, you know, perhaps are not so clear to me. For example, one of the things that I already mentioned also in some other chats, it's around the dissociation. You know, it's a very creative kind of speculation that it's in there, that let's say our different minds, etc., are dissociated alters from this universal consciousness. Yeah, so I would say that the strongest statement that he makes against physicalism, it's this one around that the conscious experiences cannot be explained even in principle via through physicalism, through physicalist ontology. That I would say is the strongest statement. Now, the strongest, let's say, claim around his ontology or idealist ontology, I don't know if there is a strongest one, right? Because it's a kind of a build based on a series of inferences, and I wouldn't know which one is really the one that. So obviously, positing that the primitive is conscious, universal consciousness. It's a clear one, but the dissociation also, I would say, it's essential, right, to explain everything else, right? So the fact that we are different minds and have our own conscious experiences, we interact, we also perceive the world. Also the perception kind of approach that he also explains. Also, it's another interesting pillar of this ontology.
Thank you. That was really good. That was what I wanted to say, but I couldn't. But yes, every point you made, I said, yeah.
Glad to help there.
Yeah, I would like to come to the point of this idea of dissociation. I think it is not really a new idea. I suspect, even though that Bernardo Kastrup never says this, writes this explicitly, but it is more or less, you can relate this to what Eastern philosophies say, mystic, especially mystic philosophies say that, especially the non-Vedanta, the non-dual teachings, but which essentially say something very similar, if not the same, that we are all an emanation, so to speak, of a one and single self, self with a capital S, the Brahman, and from which we are only individualized souls, so to speak. I don't know if he took this from there. He never says this, but I suspect that he wanted to take this and translate it in a Western philosophical context without being too explicitly mystic. And he resorts to this idea of the dissociation, which is something accepted by Western psychology. You know, these people who have dissociated personalities. So, okay, if it works in bringing this idea to Western public, it's okay for me. I have nothing against this. What I find a bit with which I'm struggling with is this idea where he cuts he sees this mind at large, which is the, well, translating into the Eastern philosophy, this Brahman, this self, and then there are we, or every living and sentient being, as these alters, and he defines consciousness inside the context of metabolic organisms. Every metabolic organism is conscious, whereas the rest is not. This mind at large is the metabolic organisms at the physical level are an expression of this mind at large, individualized expressions, but then there is somehow this void. You have consciousness and something that has nothing to do with consciousness. That is, I mean, everything that is not a metabolic organism. Okay, in fact, I mean, I'm struggling with the idea that a stone is conscious or has a mind. But what my problem is, how could then evolution come into being in the first place, before that this first cell, first unicellular organism, this first metabolic organism, could be created from something that is not conscious at all. He doesn't explain this, or at least I couldn't find an explanation for this. Therefore, he makes a step which is huge, I think. And the impression is that he resorts to classical physicalism there. He says, from the biochemical reactions in this primordial soap, well, there everything goes according to the physicalist biochemical reactions, as in classical physics and classical biology and Darwinian evolution, etc. And then when the first metabolic organism forms, then there's consciousness. Here I'm just expressing my difficulty in making this step, when I read about his philosophy. For the rest, but in any case, I think he's going in the right direction, I think. But there are many things that should still need to be trimmed, so to speak.
Can I add what Marco you just said? Yes, I completely agree that it's almost a copy paste of the Advaita Vedanta. Like from what I know, it's very. So I even got the feeling that he found a niche that okay, I'm going to just translate this Advaita Vedanta to the idealism concepts of the Western. So in that sense, there is exactly the Brahman and the Atman, and so yeah, I'm reading. For me, that I have some foundings in the non-duality. I'm reading non-duality in just in different terms, in different words. But then there is and also the thing of like the mystics and the people who experience and who like have this background of of the spiritual tradition. Or there is a meme called that we are universe just experiencing itself, so or we are God experiencing itself. And in a more simple where like God is bored, he's just bored, so he created us to have some fun, to this dualistic playground. So, and in that sense, I'm not sure if that when you say that the metabolism, and I'm not sure if I understood correctly, like that the consciousness only appears when there is a metabolic process. But so at the ultimate level, he says that consciousness simply is. So it gets to that point that there is the ground level is like it simply is. While as in physicalism is also, it doesn't even have like this end. I'm not sure if I understood correctly, but so in case of the rocks or the inanimate thing, yeah, that's I'm not, yeah, what could it be that it just simply is, that like the consciousness, it's always, and then there is the ripples, excitations of the experience, excitations, and that's just manifestation of the consciousness. Yeah.
But I find also that he almost contradicts himself when he comes up with the excitations of consciousness and relates this to quantum field theories and says that quantum field theories are excitations of consciousness, which substantially I would also be sympathetic to this idea. But then the idea of consciousness goes beyond just the metabolic organism. You have it also in the electrons. He's almost panpsychist, but then denies it. Maybe I didn't understand him here, but sometimes he doesn't say it explicitly, but he perhaps even himself does not realize that what he's saying is substantially, as I'm bottom-up panpsychism, which is not in contradiction with the top-down. For me, for him, yes, but for me, not.
Yeah.
Well, he does say that the I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but the visible cosmos is the extrinsic appearance of the inner universal mind, or the something like that. Is that familiar to anyone? He says this in well, I don't actually, I know it's somewhere in this book, but yeah, so I tend to gravitate to his sort of cosmopsychism. So I think just trying to identify, trying to place Bernardo on the map is an interesting exercise, and I have not managed to it's really not that clear just where exactly he belongs, or if he is, I mean, he is ranging across various territories, right? But he's always bringing the battle to his enemies, right? To their fortress, right? It's like, okay, we're gonna blow down the doors, right? Anyway, that's a different topic. That's all.
Did you want to say something, Michael? You had unmuted there just a moment ago.
I'm not sure if this. I struggle, and he's not the only one, but I struggle with people that approach things from a binary either or kind of approach. Not that that's not, it has merits. It does have merits. But when you just stay in that either or, and like several of you were saying, and he's trying to make his case by attacking the other, and when he comes back from attacking, it feels let down to me. I'm going, where's the I don't like the word non-dual, but the wholeness of bringing it back. And because he keeps coming back, and there's a either or idealism. There's a feeling that, you know, physicalism or whatever, the other point of view, there's too much of this to me of, okay, they're different, but I have a hard time with anybody that tries to set themselves up as, but based on my argument, this is the better only way. And but I really like, this is the thing, I really like listening to his words and his arguments because it is so different. And because he is maybe helping me kind of see how maybe I've been sucked into materialism, or, you know, my own thinking. Although I try to do my best not to get sucked into anything unless I freely choose to. But, you know, I feel that we're at a point with where what's happening is we're having to learn how to bring online a non-binary way of thinking without dismissing the binary. We get stuck in these binary things, and for lack of a better word, I think we're trying to experience the third option, or something that, I hate to use this word because some people, it plays into the word transcendence, but beyond the binary. So that's what I was thinking and listening to all of you. And I love everything that everybody, what they're bringing to the table. It's really helped me a lot. Thank you.
So Marco, I just wanted to follow up on one thing that you, about this, let's say, metabolic versus non-metabolic, and this division, right? Let me see if I understood well what Bernardo is trying to say. So I think he differentiates between, so everything is in consciousness. That's the kind of a starting point. So both animated, let's say these metabolic living organisms, and inanimated. And what I think he's saying is that this dissociation basically happens, the dissociated alters that we see, so us, thinking people, but not only humans, animals, and also plants, etc. Because I think he goes even unicellular, like the amoeba he was mentioning as well, as the extrinsic appearance of these dissociated alters, right? And everything else is still in consciousness. So the inanimated things, stone, etc., still in consciousness. It's a sort of excitation of this universal consciousness, but it doesn't. These things, let's say, don't have that conscious experience that only the dissociated alters or the universal consciousness has. And I think that's that's the division he posits. In principle, I'm not, let's say, I don't see a contradiction there. Perhaps with the fact that everything is in consciousness and everything that we see, we perceive, etc., is the extrinsic appearance, but only these biological, let's say, organisms are the ones that have intrinsic experience and conscious experience and can perceive things. A stone, for example, wouldn't have an intrinsic experience, and I think the way that he tries to defend this position is that he can see a clear distinction between what biological life, how biological life interacts with the let's say environment, and inanimated let's say things interact with the environment. So there is certain interaction and you know, perception and then action and volition and all that you see in biological life, and you don't see in animated. So I think it's, I would say, from the observational empirical point of view, I think it's a tenable position, and I don't see from the ontology perspective a contradiction there necessarily.
Yes, thank you, James, because now I'm realizing, listening to what you were saying, I'm now realizing that I'm working with some hidden assumptions with which are quite different than the assumptions that Bernardo's, and it seems also the assumption with which you are working with. And these are concern the evolution process. How do we conceive what is the cause, the power, the will? How can we say the volition? We are speaking about volition, action, will of conscious organisms, and the question is this volition, action, and will just an emergent property of these organisms, or is this already something fundamental prior to them? And it is difficult to me to conceive of consciousness without volition, will, action, some force, some power. For me, the evolutionary process here, in some sense, I'm very Darwinist. In other sense, I'm not at all. I believe that in the evolutionary process, there is, so to speak, a teleological power that stands behind it. And if we conceive this evolution just as a normal biochemical and physicalist evolution, with the only exception that the organisms are conscious, but if you see this evolution of conscious organisms just as the continuation of a physicalist evolution, strictly material evolution, then you are right. There's no contradiction in this sense. The evolution, the biological evolution of the sentient beings, of the conscious metabolic organisms, is just a continuation of the evolutionary process that from the Big Bang to nowadays. So there is no contradiction. But then, how much is this? Does this differ? This idea differ from a strictly materialist, physicalist point of view? I would say not much, which is an opinion. Of course, everyone can take this idea and stick at this idea. But then I would say we are not going much further than normal materialist and physicalist perspective of evolution, with the only difference that there is some incarnated soul or mind or consciousness in us, but otherwise we are just robots which are experiencing. We are just robots experiencing. And I don't think that Bernardo thinks this either. So
I think he's got some other essays on will, and he's now gonna have a book on Schopenhauer, exactly. And if I remember well from what I read, because it's so much reading nowadays, I think he posits that there is will, okay, and I'm not fully sure, but I think he's got also a position regarding evolution. He's got a position regarding evolution and will and natural laws as the extrinsic appearance of this will, if you want, of this universal will. I don't know if this could reconcile with this evolution point that you make or not, to be honest. But I see where you are going about the evolution. But I believe he defends that there is will, but not the kind of will, is not the sort of will that we are eventually, as a human being, conscious person. It's not will in that sense. It's he talks about this universal will and all that. So we can.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, sorry. Just to differentiate between the individual will and volition to do certain things, but our ability to change things in the universe, it's infinitesimal. Let's say we are not able to do anything, but this is different from this universal will.
Yeah. I didn't imply the human will, but there is. If we think that consciousness has some will and so there is some volition of some type, yes, more or less, whatever. But my point was, or more than a point, that the question: how then, if we assume this idea of Bernardo Kastrup, or that, how is the transition from the inanimate to the inanimate universe possible? If we posit that the inanimate universe is only something purely material and develops as such, okay, but then we have to say it clearly. From that point to that point, it's purely a mathematical machine, nothing else. But if you don't say that, I don't see how an inanimate material universe made of atoms and molecules does form this first cell without a conscious will that is driving in this direction. I mean, it is.
But that is this universal conscious will, right? That is driving that evolution.
Yeah.
And to a certain point in time, to start dissociating into alters. And, yes, and the first dissociation will be the first cell. Let's put it this way, right? That would be my.
Yes, but then
interpretation.
There is this universal consciousness that uses matter from a from a bottom up approach and forms these first metabolic organisms. But then there must be some consciousness in the inanimate matter working in the inanimate matter.
You're looking
Otherwise, I
for
don't
the,
see a logic. I think
you're looking for the big bang.
yeah,
you look-
it's also
Does
If
it's
that-
I
also
might-
sort of a
If I might say, I'm not sure that this helps the discussion at all. I am finding it very useful, the discussion, because I'm getting a clear idea of what's going on. And I haven't fully read Kastrup, so that's a good thing, just to try and figure it out. But one of the things that seems to me, so at first I was sort of focusing on the fact that body doesn't seem to be present. And what you're saying, Jaime, is that it's this dissociation process that generates body from this. So this sort of inanimate comes from the dissociation process. But it seems to me that there is still this internal-external division that's built into what he's taught. And it's one of his basic facts from which everything, so he kind of assumes it to begin with. He assumes there's an internal-external division, and then, you know, whereas I have trouble with just assuming that. I want that to come out of the theory. And I don't see, you know, I don't see how that, and somehow that has to do with the argument that you're making, Marco. It has to do with, you know, so will is a kind of an internal thing, and yet inanimate is an external thing. And so there's this switch between internal. So one way or another, there's a binary problem in all of these theories, you know, whether they're, the physical one has a problem, we all know, with the consciousness, and that one is not present here because he starts off with consciousness. But what he's done, he's moved the problem to a different place. And the binary still shows up, but it shows up in this internal versus externalism, which is assumed rather than, anyway, that maybe I got that wrong. I'm happy to listen to your ideas about that. But
it seems
I
like
don't
a
think
really
it's
good,
matter.
sorry,
Go
good
ahead,
point.
go ahead, Kyle.
Well, just that it's a good point that is not obvious. If you look at, you know, all these various arguments, but it's really obvious when he says that, you know, things like the extrinsic appearance of something, right, is the extrinsic appearance of internal consciousness, right? So I think, anyway, thank you for that, Jeff.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of pick up on a number of these threads. One of the problems I had when I first got into these chapters in particular is I still wasn't clear on what he meant by consciousness. He's not one of these folks that likes to sit down and say, this is what I mean by that. He does do that in places, but it's always later on when his readers are getting desperate and one wants to see something. Because what he starts with is what he calls TWE, that which experiences. And the fundamental point of his argumentation is experience and that which experiences are not different in nature. So fundamentally, everything begins with experience. Now that sounds a whole lot like phenomenalism to me, but we'll let it go for a while. But later in these two chapters, I think it's in chapter 5, he suddenly, and he does do this. This was the point, I'm glad you brought it up, Marco, about the evolution. All of a sudden the word shows up and it's used as if it was that everybody knows what we're talking. Biology shows up and it's like everybody knows what we're talking about. Well, not in this context, I don't. I know what it is in another, but you just told me that other one was hooey. I'm not supposed to think of it like that. So I'm trying to think of it in some other way and I'm having trouble. And at one point, he simply equates that which experiences with universal mind. Well, mind, to me, I hate the word. I've mentioned that before because it's one of those words that says everything and says nothing. We only have it in English, I think. I don't know if others have something that's actually equivalent to it. But to me, mind and that which experiences are qualitatively different. And whatever is in mind, there's a lot more in mind. And now we come to these things like that you were mentioning: volition, action, intention, you know, all of those things that lead somewhere are, you know, because experience, there are active experiences, but if I go to seek an experience, and the Germans do have two words for active experience and passive experience. You can erleben and you can erfahren. You see, so they do make a distinction between those kinds of things, which we don't have in English. But all of a sudden, it's mind. And out of this mind, I think this is kind of this universal mind, he then, in the next chapter, 6, equates, again, just automatically, Marco pointed this out, with the quantum field. So the quantum field is mind. He simply redefined physics in that case, in that sense. It's not his place to do it. So I've got these added qualities, and I was stuck at the same place Marco was. How do you get to inanimate? Because he talks about this experiencing and that self-contained. I found that dissociation, I didn't take it in that non-dual sense. I thought since he took it out of the psychological disorder manual, it was kind of a creative approach to, I'm going to take a pathology and make that the basis of my ontology, where it's not a pathology at all. It's an essentiality. We have to dissociate in order to have individual instances of alters, and his, as he calls them, of this universal experiencer, that which experiences, regardless of how we understand it, which is another place where, well, it could be anything, so we won't get into too much detail, because then I'd have to nail myself down a little bit. We got to keep this open. So, and the whole discussion about the inanimate came up in conjunction with the quantum physical notion of observation. Is it a wave or a particle? It depends on how I observe it. And so if this now universal mind observes something, that excitation that it observes of itself, it's a self-reflective observation, creates something inanimate. But if, to use another metaphor that he uses in another place, if a whirlpool comes up in that consciousness that dissociates, then it takes that consciousness with it. Well, it takes mind with it. It has to take now it has to take mind with it, because the observation of consciousness that makes it inanimate is no different in essence from the whirlpool that dissociates from it. So they are actually, they have to be of the same essence, according to his logic. You know, this isn't, I don't think I'm making this up, but that's how I was following how he's going. So the inanimate object is simply an extrinsic appearance of that which experiences observation originally. I don't know how, it's a long way from there to tables and chairs, okay? And so in order to get to tables and chairs, we need evolutional work, okay? And now we can let these dissociated entities, these alters, evolve. Now, getting them into a skin as a self-contained, because for him that is the border. It is, the border is the skin. So you have to get them a skin. And you do that by adding biology, because life and biology just appear. I don't know where they come from, but they're there. Is it because that was because he makes a distinction between thoughts and perceptions. Was that a thought of this universal mind, or was it a perception of that universal mind that allows life to infuse whatever dissociated alter is there so that it can distinguish itself from the rest of what it finds in its environment. And for me, that was, all of you have been describing exactly where I also stumbled, where I was trying to figure out, well, how do I piece this all together? And this is where I'm a little bit uneasy about him jumping off into quantum physics to explain how it is that in the mind, something works. Because I don't think quantum physics intent was to define or to clarify how minds work. You know, I think the intent there was another, you know, so.
I think you are raising very good points. What I've seen reading and watching Bernardo and reading Bernardo is that even if he comes with this idealist ontology, okay, which is mostly sort of a spiritualist, if you want, kind of a philosophy, he has a background in computer science, and he has been working in science for a good chunk of his life. And I think he's trying to reconcile what basically where we stand with science today, including evolution. I think he's defending let's say Darwinism as a plausible theory of evolution, etc. So he's not contradicting that, and he tries to do that reconciliation. So going back to your question and also to Marco on the how is life coming out of inanimate matter, I think you would get the same response, I believe. Okay, I'm not Bernardo, but from what I've read, that you would get from a physicalist, right? Or you know what? There was a moment where from this inanimate matter and combination of different inorganic and organic chemistry, the first kind of cell came out, and then out of it, then life started, right? And I think you are going to get exactly the same answer. I don't think you are going to get a different answer. Perhaps you will get a different answer to the question, not so much how, but the why. And perhaps the answer to the why question from Bernardo's perspective is that you have this universal consciousness that has a will, a volition, okay, has some thoughts, and at some point, and also he makes a point, I don't know if you've read that in the I think it was in chapter 5, where he equates self-reflection to actually dissociation. So I'm not fully sure how he basically makes that connection and how he substantiates that, but he says it basically goes together, right? So the fact that this universal consciousness is also self-reflecting also causes this dissociation. And perhaps it took, from the Big Bang and all that, so he's not also against the Big Bang, etc. To all that process, evolutionary process, to create, to get to the first dissociation, right? But it's only in these dissociated alters that the extrinsic appearance are these biological organisms, or the other way around, only biological organisms can have this being conscious, right? So that's my interpretation. So you're not going to find from that perspective a different answer. And because also he seems to know a bit of quantum physics, then he's also tried to reconcile also this ontology and put it in perspective of with his ontology.
Just a quick note, I have to go, so I hate to break it up.
Yeah,
but
well,
it's
it's
a
nice
great
having you here,
discussion.
Jeffrey. Maybe you can make it for the next time here. We'll talk about the times and
Okay.
see how things go.
Okay.
It's good seeing
Thanks.
you again.
So
Thanks.
I want to ask a question that I feel is out of my ignorance, but is this centering around us deciding what is the ground of our own being? Is it matter or is it consciousness? Is that the the working question of what is the ground. And when I say that, it made me an image that popped into my head. It's like turning a pyramid upside down. It's, you know, just as a visual effect. I mean, we have this, you know, our assumptions, and we're always going like this, up, 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 up. And as I was listening to everybody, I'm going, well, that's what popped into my mind, as we're really trying to make assumptions. And I'm not saying that's what we have to work with. I'm not trying to be against that, but like Ed has said, that we have to dig down and be aware of what are our assumptions. If nothing else, they're not working behind the scenes. They're more right up in front. And so that's the impressions I'm getting from what we're talking about. I guess I just wanted to share those impressions.
I think those are good things to share, Michael, because that's precisely, it's a good description of how I feel about all of this. Bernardo's making a very definite case for a particular way of viewing why there's reality at all, and what constitutes that reality. And that's not something that we generally do every day of the week. We don't get up on Monday morning and decide, oh, gee, what I'm gonna figure out what reality is and why it's that way. But everyone has an idea of their own on how that is. It might be naive, and it might be specialized, and it might be informed, it might be academic, it might be a lot of things. It could be experiential. And depending on how you approach this, like we were talking with Jeffrey before, where you start from has a big impact on where you end up. Now, when you're trying to explain where we end up is where we all are, talking on the internet, all sitting in rooms with tables and chairs, and we have, you know, families and blah, blah, whatever, you know, how we get to that it's a long way. It's a very involved process. And when we follow that back, so to speak, we realize, well, there's some things that we just think that's the way it is. Because how else do you do it? You have to start thinking somewhere. And what I think people like Bernardo are helping us do is confronting us with somebody that went through that process a little more intensely than we generally do. But we are interested in that kind of thing, so we engage it and we try to figure out, well, what is that? He does. This is not a criticism. He would probably take it as such. It's not a criticism, but he mixes a whole lot of different views together. And I think a lot of it has to do with where he comes from. He comes from a scientific, mathematical, computer background. So one of his cheesy diagrams, and I agree with Kyle, they're really cheesy. Okay? But one of his cheesy diagrams has a Greek letter for this and a small letter and others, and there's an equation and a formula gets written down because at some point it has to look mathematical. Even if it isn't, but it has to look that way. Because if it doesn't look that way, people are going to go, oh, you're just making it up. Well, a lot of mathematical formulas are made up. You know, they're based on, you know, I think when Einstein came up with E equals mc squared, I think he just made it up because it seemed to him to describe what it is that he was thinking. And other people could take that because it's right there in front of you, and you can start playing with it. You can start working with it. You can start digging into it to see, well, what does that actually mean? What's he saying there? And so that has knock-on effects, and we have, in the end, quantum physics and debates and whatever it is that's going on. And we are having big arguments about, you know, how particles come into existence and are they even particles? Because according to, you know, the ultimate Kastrup conclusion is it's just the extrinsic appearance of an idea. But that extrinsic appearance, when I think about the table that I bumped my head on when I bent over to pick up my grandson's crayons, was damn hard. Okay, so we haven't even gotten to how it gets hard because it's just an idea. And ideas aren't hard, but ideas, we know from other things, cause the deaths of millions of people more than anything. So that, you know, such something as insubstantial as an idea can have devastating effects. So, and it doesn't have to be universal mind that comes up with them, you know. Because the last ideas that I see that have caused a lot of death seem to be rooted very deeply in certain individuals.
That reminds
others agreed. You know.
That reminds me of the Star Trek episode where Captain Cook is referencing ideas being in the air. They exist, and how careful are we of breathing them in? Now you can't see them, you can't touch them. It, you know, was his reference, but how much of our lives are governed by these ideas coming into our experience? I'm just going to put it that way because I don't want to locate it anywhere, you know, anywhere in the body, you know, brain or whatever.
But we can locate that in chapter 6 because that's precisely one of his diagrams. There's the alters and there's these thoughts, and these thoughts impinge on the alter, and these thoughts are in this universal mind. And these thoughts are non-perceptions. They're not perceptions. So universal mind can perceive and it can think. So it already has two functions, one of which wasn't defined. Okay? So, and it can think. And these, but it also, this comes back to a discussion we had once, Michael, thoughts are things and we don't think them, we encounter them.
Yeah, right.
So is that part of this impingement? Am I, in another discussion group, I used the metaphor of a radio. Am I just a radio receiver running around picking up thoughts? Or, which according to Bernardo, I probably could do, but I can't use my thoughts to impinge on external reality. He does say that very categorically. And my question for him would be, how do you explain psychokinesis if you can't do that? Because that is a violation of that. The thoughts in here, and I can't only influence, I can't impinge. So he has a couple of conundrums. Marco had pointed this out before. You don't have the conundrums that physicalism has. You have others. It's like Jeffrey said, you just moved the problem over here. You've moved the problem over here. You still have to deal with something that you don't want to deal with, or not going to be able to deal with, or going to have trouble dealing with. You know, I think your point's well taken there. I mean, one.
But if I may question something, is that I always hear that we say that thoughts are not perceptions. I'm not sure about that. It depends from what we mean by perception. If we mean only sensory perceptions of the physical world, of course they are not perceptions. But I can also say that I perceive my thoughts. And I don't think it's just a play of words. If you shut your eyes, and I think this is something that you realize when you go try to make meditation and try to shut off your mind and to get into this ideal meditative, deep meditative state where there are supposedly no thoughts, and then you will see how difficult it is to shut up. But what you are realizing that there are thoughts that come and go, and you are perceiving thoughts. And I can ask, in what sense are these thoughts so different than sensory perceptions? Yes, they are somehow in an inner field, whereas the perception of a table is something that is out. But also this three-dimensionality, isn't it something that you have in you? And that's why I'm in a certain sense, I am an idealist. To explain why I usually use this hard fact of science, neuroscience, and say, when you see a table, you don't see the table. First of all, you have to think about it. What you see eventually is a reflected light from the table. And this light shines on your retina. And do you see something at that point? You don't see nothing, zero. There's a very complex elaboration and information, how do you say, elaboration of this light, these photons get transformed into a biochemical signal that then is transmitted to your nerve, optical nerve. Do you see something at that point? You don't see nothing, not a thing. And already the signal, it has nothing to do with the table. It is neither the table itself nor the reflected light. It's has become a biochemical signal in your optical nerve. Then it reaches your the visual cortex, which is something behind your brain there, and there's a very complex elaboration, and it's a complete mess. And then, do you see something at that point? No, you don't see a thing yet. Only there's a strange mechanism that only when these data are distributed all over the brain, then suddenly you see something. So what do you see really of the world? It is always an internal perception. What you are seeing is just something in a biochemical reaction somewhere in your brain that has nothing to do with the outer reality. But it's not a, I would say it's not even an opinion, it's just hard facts of science. So in this sense, I think the step to idealism is almost, I can't see how one cannot make the step. It's unavoidable in some sense. This doesn't mean that nothing exists. Maybe there is some objective reality out there, but it had nothing to do with what we realize in, and everything is always an internal experience, never external.
Okay, I'm having a hard time with the way you're languaging it, because you're describing an interaction. There's an interaction going on. Now, yes, the pattern we bring to it, you know, because everything you described is the brain's natural instinct to make patterns of what it is experience, you know, through the senses. So it doesn't necessarily mean, it just means that we're, through our experience and our brain making pattern, we've separated ourselves so that we can know what that, in some sense, know. And that's probably where idealism comes in, because what we're doing is we're creating an idea of what is this experience of interacting with hot, cold water. Or, you know, the Tibetans, they have an attitude that thought is actually a sixth sense. And we don't have just five senses. Our nervous system is so spread out, like you described, Marco, that I think the materialist just wants to focus on five senses, and I don't want to negate that. But I question, why do we just get stuck on the five biological, when you even pointed to it, that what about the sense of orientation when we're perceiving? And the act of perception, perception is an act. When you move, your perception is going to change. You're interacting with the environment, and the environment is interacting with your biology. So I just, can you help me understand if I'm close, or where are we between the two of us?
I'm sorry, Michael, but I did not understand the question. So was it a critical?
The question is your point that how you made a statement about, what was it, that you know, it's all in you know, in us, what's doing that, and it has nothing to do with out there. And maybe I didn't understand how you were phrasing that, because
No.
It's an interaction. I'm more coming from a place of how that is an interaction.
Maybe I didn't express it exactly. It is not. It's not that all is in us, but everything that we see of the world, what we call the physical world, the external world, is in any case an experience in us.
Okay. Okay. That helps. That helps. That helps.
If this implies that also the world that we see is just somehow, this is a solipsistic, or there are some people who say then everything is only my imagination that doesn't exist.
Yeah, okay.
I'm more skeptic about that. I believe there is some outer objective inherent reality out there, but the essence, the things in itself, as Kant used to say, have nothing to do with what we perceive. What we perceive is just a symbol.
Okay.
The difference between a symbol and a representation, a representation is when I make a picture, and I more or less I can make a picture of a table which has some form and so on, and can be more or less realistic and be, if not 1-to-1, 0.5-to-1 representation of the table. A symbolic representation is just writing the word table. The word table is a symbol for the table, but this symbol has nothing to do with the table as it is in itself. And that's how I think we perceive the world. And I just use this neuroscientific example because it's perhaps more understandable in our modern world, but it's nothing new in reality. Already Kant, Schopenhauer, Schelling, all these guys already realized it in other ways.
Well, and I think I was just listening through my own lens of understanding Evan Thomas and Varela about the embodied cognition and how it's enacted, that our brains aren't just in our skulls, they're permeable, and there's something, and I don't think it dismisses what you're saying. I don't think it dismisses at all. I just think it helps me understand, for me, that I don't get, or I question that assumption of how I'm isolated and disassociated from everything in a negative sense. I'm using that in a total negative sense. Disassociated.
And I think, by the way, sorry, Kyle, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to point out that so Marco did a good job of describing in a very physical framework the perceptual process, right? But there's also when you say, well, a table is a symbol, what does it take for that table to become a symbol, right? I mean, there's a very deep connection between creating that table in your mind and having the experience of tables in general. So, right, this is where you get into universals, right? So a table becomes a symbol because, wow, you're not seeing me, are you?
No, I see you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to point out just the extent to which we are in, regardless of our philosophical persuasions, we are so deeply in a physicalist framework that, you know, when we start talking about things like this, I mean, we aren't even questioning, you know, why are we talking about neurology as opposed to phenomenology, right? Why is neurology more important than phenomenology? Basically, is the question. And well, there's an easy answer to that. Look at where we live, right? We live in a deeply physicalist framework. So somehow we have to give that its due, and yet, you know, really, as far as I'm concerned, phenomenology is way more interesting than neurology, but that's because I'm not, you know, that's me.
Yeah, well, and I'm trying to move myself of not getting caught up a binary, because I take Marco's point in his description of how neurology may be adding more to phenomenology from its perspective. It's different, but I want to be sure for myself I'm not getting stuck in it's either or black or white. That it's differentiating, and then there's some work of, well, how do they come together, or integrate might be a word, you know. So but Marco, you did a good job of helping me, you know, because I think I probably, you know, from my point of view, jumped the gun on listening how I heard what you said. So thank you.
And also, Marco, I think Bernardo also would agree with, so fully agree with what you are saying, no, in terms of, I think this is one of his basic tenets, right? That the only thing that we really can be sure of, it's of our own experience, and everything else is a bit of an inference, you know, but not really something that we can know. We can know only our experience. And I think because it was talked before, he talks also in the paper, differentiates between thoughts and perceptions being what we actually sense through our senses. And what you just talked about, the symbolic representation of whatever it's outside. Also, he says that basically, yes, it's definitely different, and it's been the evolution, precisely, again, evolution, that that made that we perceive in the way that we perceive for our own survival, right? So we actually simplify the world, and as you mentioned also, Michael, in terms of patterns, that this is our instinct to, our mind to really see the world through patterns. It's just a survival mechanism, because if we would, so his argument is that if we would see the world as it is, or the reality as it is, we wouldn't be alive anymore, right? So we would be not any more dissociated. So I think also there is a correlation between dissociated state and our physical life, and the moment that you pass away, you are not anymore dissociated, and you know that it's another of the kind of consequences of corollaries of his theory, is that you then become part of this universal mind or consciousness. By the way, Ed, I think he uses mind and consciousness indistinctly. So I don't think he makes a difference. And also what I struggle sometimes is that he said that thoughts and experiences, so experiences in general and mind are of the same nature. I think I would agree with that. I struggled with that concept, with that assertion before, you know, because he says, look, ripples are just water in motion, right? So thoughts or experiences are consciousness in motion. This is his analogy. I think I buy into that, unless you have different views on this. But there is more than just thoughts and perceptions. I think there is volition. There is other things that mind or consciousness does, right? And sometimes he brings this onto there without explaining very much, because he starts thoughts and perceptions, but then he talks about volition and talked about other things that mind or consciousness does. But you know, it's all put in the same bucket, and sometimes I struggle a bit with that, but I guess I'm fine.
Yeah, I want to express a struggle, not that I'm negating it, that about this issue of all we can know is our experience or conscious experience. But my experience with that is, what do you do when your own experience is your own worst enemy? Case in point, I attempted suicide. That was my experience. It drove me to that. So I struggle with, I honor that we need to feel into, acknowledge our experience, but what about the case when our own experience, and I don't know what's, maybe it's the way we're, you know, something disassociates and causes us to lose sight of our normal, whatever that is, way of experiencing. But what happens when your own experience is turned against you? I'd like to understand how Bernardo would view that. I'm not sure if I understood that with the reading.
Let me just, well, my idea is that Bernardo doesn't have the answers on that level, that he's just proposing a shift of paradigm. And in that shift of paradigm, we might eventually be able to create a world or an environment that would not lead so much to the cases of those experiences. This is in the idealistic sense. So instead, I'm gonna put it in a very drastic way. Instead of relying in the hardcore physicalist brain-centered biomedical model, we might, with this paradigm, detach ourselves a bit more, and in that process, they might come up new ways of to healing or to understand that experience. But is something that is going to be seen just later on a more macro, long term.
Thank you, Daniel.
Maybe to connect with this idea of the question of the neurology point of view or the phenomenological point of view, I am someone who believes that mind, what we call mind, I mean now the intellectual aspect, rationality, logical thinking, reason, what we call reason, and so I mean that, not what Bernardo means, is a limited human function. It is just one step in the evolution of the forms of cognition of living beings. And we are just that one step, actually, on at least on this planet, perhaps the most evolved. It's not ethical judgment that it is better or more noble, but at least humans are able to build spaceships and computers and animals not, so we can say that it is the most evolved, but it is not the last rung of the ladder. Having said that, when I dump down mind, I add usually one thing, that mind has something very powerful in itself, and if mind is honest with itself and it doesn't tell itself fairy tales and is not captured by ideological or dogmatic or some kind of ideological political ideas or whatever, it is able to find its own limits. It is able to it is able to tell itself that I cannot understand, and this is a line beyond which I cannot say nothing. And this honesty is not so easy because physicalists don't have this honesty. That's the point. But to connect this to the idea of this neurological example that I usually make is, yes, first of all, because we are just in a society which loves to reduce everything to neurons, biological cells, genes, molecules. So I just catch the opportunity. In fact, I said, it's not really a new idea. Also, I think even Plato had some ideas like that, where he had this idea of the cavern and the shadows on the cavern. And this is idealistic point of view. But with this neurological example, I think you can show the limits of neurology itself. Because if you understand that, for example, take a neuron, you have an idea of this, what a neuron is. But this idea is already a symbol translated internally. When you think at a neuron or matter, a chunk of matter, atoms, or is a symbol in yourself. Sorry, no, I don't mean that they don't exist. It is a translation into a symbol in yourself, I mean. And from this symbol, you try to reconstruct the conscious experience. But it is already a conscious experience. So it's circular, it's recursive. And you can show this by sheer logical reasoning and neurological examples, where this reason and this neuroscience is able to show that it is limited. And that's the whole point of the, certainly not because I'm a physicalist. It's only the reason.
It would be nice if more neuroscientists would think of it in those terms, maybe. So okay, these are the limits. We know how to define the limits, and then at that point, beyond those limits, we are in a symbolic world in which it does not add anything to talk about the cellular level or, you know, the biological level. So they're just kind of building on, you know, the symbol builds on what you have already cognitively, right? If you didn't have those cognitive capabilities, nothing could be a symbol for you. Has anybody heard of Eugene Gendlin?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
He talks a lot about symbols and about how, I mean, he's fascinating to me. So
Yeah.
he kind of cuts through a lot of shit, you know, as far as a lot of BS that's.
Well, and he's also, his approach is to accept the implicit and actually, my understanding is he's trying to show where the conceptual and the experiential are linked together. The conceptual is definitely a capacity to make sense of experience, but the experience and the conceptual, they kind of intertwine, because the more we bring attention to the kinds of concepts or assumptions we have, our experience was change.
Right.
And this is what I experienced through referencing of healing from my attempted suicide. I had to at least use his kind of approach to experience what those concepts, those symbols were, how they were affecting me and holding me in a certain spot, which is kind of ties to Marco's understanding of how to use the mind to look at its own limitations. Eugene General, that whole thing came out of him seeing and paying attention how good therapists helped others to get unstuck from their cognitive tape loop that keeps a certain experience perpetuating a certain experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. And I think I tend to criticize Bernardo for spreading himself too thin, trying to cover too much territory. I mean, he's okay. He's got a PhD in philosophy. Most people who have a PhD in philosophy, they're the things they write are confined to fairly reasonable range of things. They don't try to explain all of existence, right? This is a serious faux pas on the part of philosophers if they're trying to extend themselves a little too far, maybe. So I don't know. I think that what it shows is that it's really not about academic philosophy. I mean, what Bernardo's doing, that's not really what it's about. And he's a popularizer, but he's got too many ingredients in his soup for my taste.
But you sound like you've obviously taken something from the soup that you appreciate.
I do, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
And, it's just
too spicy for you?
Trying to find the right metaphor. I don't know.
Yeah,
it doesn't always
I know.
work.
I do that. I kind of, you can actually add, I pop with metaphors sometimes.
Yeah, me too.
Very good, Kyle. Very good.
I think some of that, Kyle, has to do with the fact of what do you choose as your discipline within the greater discipline. So within philosophy, you can be an epistemologist and you can try to figure out or explore or show or explain how we know things, or you can become an ontologist, and then you've just got a bigger piece of the pie in some regards, because you have to explain or show or demonstrate or in some way make clear to others what reality is about or what being is about. It's a discipline that a lot of very memorable people have become involved in. Because I include the phenomenologists in that whole, the Husserls and the Heideggers and the Hegels and the Kants. That's basically what they're all trying to do. And when you look at all of them, or any of them, especially the Germans, they tend to have Bernardo's harmless in comparison. He can at least put what he has to say here in 150 pages. Okay, Hegel never managed that. His essays were longer than that. So, you can really go off the deep end, but I think also in as much as I criticize him, in his defense, I think what he's trying to do, and the way he's trying to do it, you know, when you think that you said there are probably more entertaining ways to say all of this, and he did a lot of that kind of entertaining work before. And his book Materialism is baloney. I mean, I think the title tells you it is an entertaining read. And he takes a very hard approach towards people that think materialism is the be all end all of our understanding. But this particular book is a product of that academic endeavor. He says, I'm going to go play the game. There's a game that has to be played. Anybody can get paper if they play the game long enough. So you play the game and you can get the paper, and that's fine. But he's still trying in his own way. This book, not in particular, because it is probably it's the most technical one of his that I've ever read. I've read a bunch of them. The rest of them are more essay-like, and they're more conversational, and they're more direct. But here he's making a particular case that he's trying to argue, and he knows that the people who are first and foremost going to be reviewing it are going to be people who fundamentally disagree with him, because they are of probably a more materialistic bent. Though one of the things, he doesn't say it explicitly or in here, one of the things is, if you look at materialism, it's got flavors that aren't as hardcore, and you can even materialism itself is struggling to find new ways to express what it is that it actually wants to say, and is allowing certain things to come in that were once absolutely taboo. Because not to be contrarian, but I'm all for hardcore physicalists going balls to the wall to try and refute and overturn whatever it is that he's bringing up. Because if you're not going to stop and reflect upon the limits, this would be the ideal sense of using your mind that Marco was talking about. I can reflect and realize I have certain limits. Well, the other way to find that you have limits is to run into the wall often enough. And then you go, oh, I just don't get past that for some reason. And maybe I'll stop and think about it. And I think that was my interpretation of Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolution is just that. You know, when you absolutely positively have no other recourse, you go, oh shit, okay, I'll change my mind and I'll start thinking something else, you know. But until that time, I'm gonna hold fast to everything that I'm ever, and sure, it's for the rest of us that have to deal with all of that, we'd like an easier trip, because we don't want to go through that whole process of trying to have you guys sort it out. But, you know, go have fun and go do that. It's very important for me to know these kinds of things, so that when I do pick someone up and start reading them, I get a quicker feel for where they're coming from. And when I have a feel for where they're coming from, I also get a quicker feel for how much effort I'm going to put into following it, or whether I'm going to put it down and pick up something else. Because, you know, there's only so much time, there's only so many hours in the day that I can, interact with this kind of stuff. So in that regard, it's helpful to get these things clear. And one of the things that, you know, I think Bernardo's doing, like I said earlier, even though I disagree with a lot of the things that are in there, he does make me at least, well, why do you disagree, Ed? You know, what is it precisely that you are disagreeing with? And that helps me. That I think this is the Marco's positive use of mind. I'm reflecting on my own processes to see where my limits are, and where it is I might need another view of things before before I charge ahead and tell these people, well, okay, you're full of crap, you know, well, or kind of full, or maybe not so much, or in the end I agree. I don't know. Okay, so we find that out. Well.
Yeah, I agree. We have two possible ways to discover the truth. One is to bump our head against the wall, as it seems that actually humanity is doing, or to, well, to discover, how can I say, the pleasure to realize that I'm deadly wrong. Yeah? Dead wrong. Sorry, not deadly, dead wrong. That I'm dead wrong in saying that you believe in some system and in some ideas, and then you change your mind. The pleasure to change your mind, huh? And that's something that we have to learn. But we stick at this. I believe for all my life. I believe in something, and I will never give it up. I hear many people who talk like that, and I think it's stupid. And so, but in any case, I think Bernardo, I also have a lot of critics and points that are to me very obscure, and I'm not sure to agree with him, but he's doing a good service, I think. He's doing a really great service because he is one of the few. There are also others. There are some panpsychists, cosmopsychists. There is now a movement of philosophers, but I'm following this. Well, not for all the time, but I remember that I was following these kind of philosophical thoughts about 25 years ago in the 1990s, and they were almost all physicalist, really hard physicalist materialists, and there was no way. Now we are seeing that there is a sort of renaissance, and Bernardo is one of the main figures who is bringing forward this. And I think many things may turn out to be not so good, or not the right thing to, or maybe completely wrong, but his service actually is to instill this doubt in this physicalist mentality, and I think he's doing this very well. So that's
Marco,
a real
Marco, I just want to say that it's a pleasure that you articulated that I'm on the other side of the pain of beating my head and the pleasure of thinking. Thank you. I like the way you put that.
You're welcome. Yeah,
I really like that.
Yeah, but I'm still learning this lesson.
Oh, well, I'm still learning it too, but I've learned a few things. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Because you know that there's this ego. The ego. No. I wanted to. I'm the one who knows what the truth is. Huh?
Yeah.
But
yeah. You know, there's a Zen teacher that says you need just enough ego to cross the street. Why? So you don't get hit by the car.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, very true. I fully agree that Bernardo is doing a great job, and also he's trying to, basically his main audience, it's the Western, physicalist, basically, and the only way really to try to have a discussion is really from their own turf, right? And that's the reason that also he uses this academic analytical philosophy and all that, and he's got a PhD, he went for another PhD, etc. I think it's part of the game, right? So if you want to convince those guys, if you come from the Eastern world, spiritualist, etc., nobody's gonna listen to you because you are not taken seriously, because you are intellectually inferior to me, because you don't know how to use reason and science and scientific approach, etc. And he's trying to do that. It's difficult because still, I mean, when you read this ontology, you know, I agree that there are some areas that are a bit ambiguous and some gaps there eventually, and still sound a bit, you know, new age kind of thing. And when you just do a superficial read or even just a few things, then you're gonna find a lot of physicalists already dismissing that outright, right? But I think he's getting more and more traction, and I think it's a hard job, and he's doing the right thing, I believe. And probably it's the only way, right? So that you, from their own turf, you try to have a discussion. And there will be people that won't listen, because I agree also, Marco, with something that you said before, that I think to become an idealist, first you have to be, to have a humble, to approach, you know, these questions from a very humble perspective, right? So that to doubt about everything, and then think that to use more introspection, and you know, and trying to also deconstruct all this belief system that we have, that we believe is so robust. Because, to be honest, why physicalism also it's so strong, it's because all the achievements. So we have got very far with physicalism, right? In terms of, I mean, medicine and scientific, you know, exercise. You could argue that probably we have got in the wrong direction in many areas. I would say so, like in medicine, for example. But still, most people would agree that we have come very far, right? And because of that, it's very difficult to start questioning your own belief system, right? And because in the end, it's our egos that we want them to survive, and physicalism has served a very good purpose there.
Well, and our egos are basically formed through our survival mechanism.
Exactly.
To a large extent. Now, I personally believe that we have the capacity, from what I've heard and Marco saying, of realizing that we only need enough ego. We don't need it being a raging idiot. You know, it's okay to have an ego, but it doesn't need to be a raging idiot. Or like a lot of people, I have to say, their egos are still infantile or adolescent. They haven't matured to be had that alchemy of humility with the ego. I think so. You don't have to deny the ego, but it does need to learn humility. Well, I've learned the hard way of beating my head against the wall, and it's taught me some humility.
Well, sorry guys, it's time for me to go. So thank you for the session, and hope to see you next time.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks,
Okay,
Daniel.
that's a real good cue. If you have to go, Daniel, I had one more issue I wanted to bring up, and that's about the timing for the next session in 2 weeks. Because the Americans have already changed their clocks. So there's now an hour difference between them. The question is this: I kept it at the time we always meet for us Europeans, and our American friends had to adjust and show up an hour later. I don't know how difficult that is for them coming an hour later as opposed to an hour sooner. If not, we can just leave it the way things are for the next time as well. For the session after that, we will have moved our clocks here in the EU, and we'll be back on the same time. You're in Michigan, aren't you, Kyle? Are you in Michigan?
Right. I am.
You guys change clocks?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, because not everybody does in the United States. I know that Indiana
Right.
and Arizona don't. So
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
yeah, so there's some renegades there as well. But if it's okay, then we'll just schedule this for the same time next time.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
guys will
that's
have to
fine.
swap.
I'll put it in my calendar, 12
You'll
o'clock,
need to do
not
that,
11.
Mike, or you and Jeffrey will have to have a chat before we get together.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah,
Okay,
Well,
good. That's the
Michigan-
only thing I wanted to clarify. Then we'll
Yeah.
leave the time the way it is.
yeah.
So
Michigan's
Central
odd
European
anyway.
time is the same, 8
It'll be
p.m.
central. Yeah,
Yeah.
next week will be 20 hours of 8 o'clock p.m. Central European time. Will
That's
be
in
the
2
time.
weeks, right, Ed? 2
That'll
weeks.
be in
weeks.
2 weeks.
Yeah.
In 2 weeks. Yeah, we're trying to get 2-week intervals. For this time, I'm sure it was good because it was a long read and very dense. Next time when we move to part 3, he's going to be refuting the objections that folks might have to his ontology. And in that regard, the chapters aren't as long and they're a little lighter in their reading. They're not quite, I believe. I realized that these two were dense the first time I read them. I didn't realize how dense they was until I read them this time. And it was just like, I was really bogged down in the reading. But this was the biggest and the most difficult chunk so far.
Especially the chapter 6. Yeah, I was.
Yeah, chapter 6 was a real kicker. I didn't even get the chance to ask Marco about Ravelli's relational theory there, but maybe we'll get to that. I was just curious.
By the way, to get a bit, try to understand things a bit better, I signed up for your course, Marco, the quantum physics you've got on Udemy. Yes.
You're hurting yourself. Oh. I'm
Just
sorry for
signed
you. Okay, good luck.
I thought it could help.
Okay,
I'll try.
thank you.
I'll try that too.
Okay. Does anybody have any last comments they want to throw out here for the group before we?
Been very enjoyable, and as you say, I'm going to say before you, time well spent.
Okay. Well, that's how I feel about it.
Yeah. Glad to
And
be
I
here.
wish you all a very good couple of weeks. You know, keep the faith.
Yes.
Yeah, keep at it.
Yes.
Thank
And
you.
We'll see you
Take
next
care
time.
of yourselves.
Yeah.
Take care of
Take
yourselves.
care.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.